and thanks to the organizers of this conference. I have to say that this paper that I proposed is a part of my thesis, part of my chapter, which is entitled Time and Temporality. So it's a work in progress, actually. So I wanted to focus on a shift in temporality in modern poetry, from duration as succession to various experimental presentisms. The transition between the literature of the 19th century, such as naturalism and symbolism, and the new tendencies, as Apollinaire used to call it, of the 20th century is manifest in temporality. Of course, the new aesthetics are marked by the wish of modern poets for their art to be closer to life. Also in this period, Apollinaire, Sandra and Reverdy were very much involved in the revolutionary formal experiments that aimed to radically change the terms of artistic and literary representation, with close ties and affinities and rivalry with the avant-garde movements such as Cubism, Futurism, etc. Instead of duration as a continuation of what was, the instant is favored among poets. The instant, and I quote, takes direct and sensual contact with the outside world, and literature becomes the organ of this vibrant intimacy. End quote. This is from Georges Poulet, Études sur le temps humain. The first writers that manifest this new approach to time, according to Poulet, are Gide, Valéry, and Claudel. But however, this literary evolution did not happen from one moment to the other, and the radical present instantaneous as a discontinuity is only found in the works of next generation of poets. In works of Apollinaire, Sandra, and Reverdy, this radical temporality becomes very important issue in the aesthetic revolution of literary representation, which is no longer supposed to imitate reality, as both Apollinaire and Reverdy say in many of their essays. It is not possible within this paper to discuss at length the question of representation in this period, which is a vast question. But the following quotes by Reverdy are maybe sufficient and clear enough to speak not only for his own poetics and those of the Cubists, but also for Apollinaire, which was major influence both on him and Sandra. We find ourselves in the period of artistic creation in which people don't just tell stories in a more or less pleasing fashion, but in which they create works that, while breaking away from life, become a part of it, because they possess a proper existence outside the evocation of reproduction of things from life. This is why the art of today is an art of great reality. By this we mean artistic reality and not realism. That genre is the most to the opposite of what we do. And another quote by Reverdy: work is the result of an emotion instead of being a repetition of it. End quote. The aim is to achieve innovation in the representation, and temporality is a key factor in literary representation. As Paul Ricoeur put it, I quote, "The world that the narrative refigures is a temporal world." End quote. According to his theory of mimesis, the refiguration of time and experience encoded in the text, that he also calls mimesis 3, is activated only in the act of reading. This act of communication happens, I quote again, on the intersection between the world of the text and the world of the reader, in which the effective action unfolds itself and its specific temporality. End quote. The works of Apollinaire, Sandra, and Reverdy possess a very particular fragmented temporality which marked modern poetry of the 20th century. It is in 1912, a year when Le Bac, New York, and Zone were written, and from these poems that the problem of reality and the singular temporality of condensed present tense become more and more intertwined in their poetry as the most important element of the new poetics of Apollinaire and Sandra. A couple of years later, this became the mark of Reverdy's style as well. Now, Apollinaire and Sandra used often the word simultanéité or simultané, terms of their friend, the painter Roger Delaunay, who talked of contrast simultané des couleurs, basing himself on the theory of 19th century scientist Eugène Chevreul about the contrastive interaction of colors. However, this expression belongs also to Italian futurists who used it first to talk about time and space, and also to poet Henri-Martin Bergson, the author of Manifeste du Simultanisme. So that this term was vividly disputed between Bergson, Apollinaire and Sandra, between futurists and Delaunay. And this polemic seems very vain because from our perspective, because the problems of simultaneity seem to define the entire period, from Einstein's theory of relativity to invention of the telegraphie sans fil and telephone, which for the first time allowed to have an instantaneous and simultaneous communication at distance. It would also seem that while everybody sees this world of great actuality, they seem to have each their own ideas of what it was. However, this polemic was useful for Apollinaire to present a unified vision of his poetics and to affirm his place as the arbiter. It is the moment in the development, it is a moment in the development of his aesthetics and the new presentist temporalities. The term does not always apply to time and should therefore be taken into consideration with caution, since it points to the idea of contrast as a poetic and plastic technique, especially with Delaunay and Sandras, who is loyal to Delaunay's conception of simultané, and Sandra defines simultané as it follows. I quote, "It is the contrast that makes the death. Le simultané is the art of death." It was Delaunay who tried to say what could be this simultanism in literature. I quote, the literary simultanism can be achieved with the use of contrast of words," end quote. And this conception, while very simplified maybe, connects well with Reverdy's definition of poetic image. And I can quote that as well. "The image is a pure creation of the mind. It cannot be born from a comparison, but from two realities more or less distant brought together. The more the relation between the two realities is distant and accurate, the stronger the image will be. And the more it will possess emotional power and poetic reality." It also corresponds very well to what is new presentist poetics of Apollinaire and Zone and Sandra in prose Transsibérien. If we consider these poetics as contrast of different things, and this contrast can be a contrast of different motives, but these motives can also be temporal or imply different temporalities. And so this is the case of what I call animal machines in both Zone and Prose du Transsibérien, where we have factory sirens that bark, or herds of buses, and as Sandra puts it, les moteurs des autobus meurent comme les taureaux d'or. There is also, beside animals, of course, the Eiffel Tower as a shepherdess, and Jesus Christ as the aviator. So this is different temporalities, both very ancient and very new, brought together. And so we may ask ourselves, how is it modern? But if we think of Jean Starobinski's definition of modernity in his article about Baudelaire's poem Le Paysage, it becomes clearer because he defines what is modern in Baudelaire's poem. We have Baudelaire observes the chimneys of the factories with the bell towers of the churches. So he says what is more specifically modern is the juxtaposition and contrast and dissonance of their simultaneous presence, actually. They are different orders of time. Time of production and time of sacred or time of prayer. So the word itself does belong to vocabulary of time, and it implies time, and Apollinaire uses it with the temporal meaning. Poets can use contrasts of different temporalities, just as painters would use different colors and textures. In his polemic with Bergson, Apollinaire defines simultaneity only by opposing it to succession, and that he attributes this opposition to Delaunay. This is a capital distinction in the new poetics of instantaneous present, as we'll see, even if simultaneity is more than just a temporal notion. Of course, the word simultaneità appears first in the Futurist Manifesto Prefazione al catalogo delle esposizioni di Parigi, Londra, Berlino, Bruxelles, etc. From February 1912, and then later in Immaginazione senza fili by Marinetti. However, the Italian futurist conception of simultaneità seems different from Apollinaire's poetic of present in different things. The Italian futurists talk of several simultaneous awarenesses, la simultaneità degli stati d'animo dell'opera dell'arte, and of lirismo multilineo, and they also associate very often simultaneity with continuity. This is clearly visible in Boccioni's own works, be it in his paintings, on his very well-known sculpture, unique forms of continuity in space, from 1913. I quote Boccioni: la simultaneità è per noi l'esaltazione lirica, la plastica manifestazione di un nuovo assoluto, la velocità, the speed. Simultaneità è la condizione nella quale appaiono i diversi elementi che costituiscono il dinamismo. The key word here is dynamism. The aim is to represent spatially movement in time, and thus to change representation in something static. And this temporality's main characteristic is the violence of the speed. More importantly, this temporality does not consist in a temporal break, but rather in the continuity of succession, and Apollinaire defines simultaneity in opposition to succession. It would be better to understand this poetics of present instantaneous not so much as a purely temporal simultanism, since this expression obviously can lead to confusion, but as a sort of presentism, which is a part of broader idea of simultaneity as the art of contrasts. The problem of simultaneity before the First World War was a way for many to think various points of aesthetics. I think it's my thesis that this was the case for Apollinaire and Sandras. It helped them maybe to understand better what they were looking for on the intersection between arts and new tendencies. So the simultaneity was only one moment at the beginning of what could perhaps be called presentism in modern poetry. It is clear with Apollinaire and Sandras that it is a break from duration and exaltation of the moment. But there is also different kind of simultaneity, just as thinking about simultaneity helped Apollinaire and Sandras in rethinking the new presentist aesthetics, for Bergson the instant can only be defined by simultaneity. And here simultaneity is not an aesthetic notion. Insisting on the present was above all a way of bringing poetry closer to life, making it more alive, a way to bring closer life and art. The time of the poem is no longer that of a dream or that of a legend, but is intended as a living experience. The concept of lived time, especially in the context of the period, points directly to Bergson's notion of duration. Now, this is a slightly a paradox, since Bergson's duration is a line of succession and zone. For example, the elements of reality and reverdi, as Reverdy would say, or even memories appear suddenly as instants and abruptly in discontinuity. Now, Bergson did not recognize the punctual moments of time have any real existence, and he considered them as artificially imposed in order to measure time with space. According to him, time is nothing but succession with no real distinction between moments. He defined the simultaneity as, I quote, the possibility for two or more events to enter a single and instantaneous perception, end quote. But for him, and I quote again, simultaneities are instants. They do not participate in the nature of real time, they don't endure, end quote. In this last observation, it's visible how much Bergson's main preoccupation is conceived time as only as duration. Merleau-Ponty noted that Bergson was wrong to explain the unity of time through its continuity, for this amounts to confusing past, present, and future on the pretext that we move from one to the other through imperceptible transitions, and in short, this amounts to negating time, end quote. Bergson's conception of time corresponds exactly with great concern of his to divide the perception of time from that of space, but precisely the synthesis of time and that of space belong both to the same perception. Merleau-Ponty showed how the synthesis of time and that of space in our perception need always to start anew, and how, I quote, the act of attention is linked to previous acts precisely by overthrowing the givens, and the unity of consciousness is gradually constructed in this way through a transition synthesis. The miracle of consciousness is to make phenomena appear through attention that re-establish the object or object's unity in a new dimension at the very moment they break that unity. So time is double by nature, flow and continuity. It is also discontinuity, which accounts for succession. Paradoxically, continuity and rupture are two aspects of time, the order of coexistences as well as the order of successions, in the words of Merleau-Ponty. The two opposite aspects of time seem to exclude each other. If you observe one, the other escapes us inevitably. So if Bergson studied time exclusively as a flow, to the opposite, Gaston Bachelard stated, time has but one reality, the instant. According to him, the present and the real are one and the same thing. The present is always recommenced. This also means that it is always new, and that gives it a special dimension in the context of modernity, as Bachelard notes, affirming that, I quote, novelty is obviously always instantaneous, end quote. The discontinuity of the present is fundamentally creative and innovative. In a word, it is modern. Poetic time that we discuss here is a configured time of literary work, and according to Bachelard's theory, poetic instant is also what he names vertical time, thus distinguishing it from horizontal time of succession defined by the becoming of the world. Poet ties simultaneities and different moments together in the same instant. However, the inconvenience of this conception of poetic temporality when applied to modernist present instantaneous in the poetry of Apollinaire and Saint-Ravens is that Bachelard's vertical time subverts the time of life, as Bachelard puts it, and we know the ambition of these two poets to bring poetry and life closer together. So the necessary conclusion would be then that the poetic present instantaneous is in itself very particular mode of poetic temporality that possess both certain aspects of Bergson's duration as time that has ambition to be lived as much as possible, and on the other hand certain qualities of Bachelard's vertical time, especially rupture and the aspect of discontinuity. Now, some big questions remain that I couldn't address in format of this paper. Like, for example, how can a fragmented experience have an ambition of being as much as possible lived time? But I argue that fragments engage our reception and our perception, and thus inviting the reader to merge his horizons of expectation and engage his or her own experience. As for Reverdy, his poetics moves away from simultaneity and tends to conceive the dialectics of time as flow and instant in a more existentialist fashion through the structure of horizon, and could be read through his exploration of temporality and time. Thank you.